All right, guys, we'll just give another minute or two and then we'll get started here. All right, I will wait one more minute and we'll get started here. So today we start the nervous system. Very exciting. So we only have 2 more units left, the nervous system and the reproductive system. So that's it. And then we're done. We're getting very close to the end. Doesn't look like there'll be any back to school for us, although it looks like in Quebec, grades up to 9 are going back to school shortly, but that won't be us. And no last minute notification that suddenly we're going to have diploma exams, because I think that would cause all of us to have a heart attack. So that's not happening. All right, so I see that it's 2:01, so we're going to get started. We are going to talk about the nervous system. So just a couple of things. Endocrine worksheet number 2 is due at noon today, so make sure I get those in because I want to have those marked and back to you, hopefully by Sunday night. That way you have them to look over before you write your endocrine unit final quiz. You wrote a quiz for me it closed on Wednesday, so they're about half marked. So after this class, I'll finish off marking them. So then you can go back and look and see where your mistakes were made and email me any questions that you have. Any questions outstanding right now before we move into neurons? Alrighty. I don't see any, so we will get started. So we'll just share my PowerPoint here with you. So I did load these up, so you have them on Google Classroom. Let's just go back. So let's just start it here. There we go. Nervous system. Okay. So what we're looking at with the nervous system, I have this divided into 3 parts. Okay, so part 1, our focus on the nervous system is neurons, which are the building blocks, so the functional cells of the nervous system. Our next booklet focuses on the brain and some of the actual nerves that are in our body, and a couple of the body systems associated with that. And then our last booklet looks at special senses, where we're looking at the eyes and the ears specifically, and the different parts of those and how they function. Okay, and then that collectively is the nervous system, and then we will be done with that. All right, so nervous system, we start with neurons. So neurons, the first thing we need to know is just a little rundown of what we're going to learn about with neurons. So this is what we're learning about in this booklet. So we're going to describe the general structure and function of a neuron and the myelin sheath. So that's something we need to know. So what are the different parts of a neuron? So a neuron is a cell, but the cell has very distinguished parts. And then we have to know what the myelin sheath does. Explain the formation and transmission of an action potential. So we're going to talk about that. Including what's called an all or none response, and then how our body detects the intensity of a response, how loud a music is, how hard someone hits you, that kind of stuff. So we're going to talk about that. Explain the transmission of a signal across a synapse, including the role of acetylcholine, cholinesterase, and norepinephrine. So we're going to talk about those 3 things. And then describe using an example the organization of neurons into nerves and the composition and function of reflex arcs. All right. Like the patellar reflex, which is when a little hammer hits your knee and how you kick your leg up. That's that. The pupillary reflex is when someone shines light in your eye, how your pupil constricts. Okay. All right. So just a little rundown of the nervous system. So the way I like to describe this, it's kind of, we can relate the nervous system to a computer. Okay. So a computer has inputs that we put into the computer. So that's what we're talking about here. These for us are sensory inputs, but for a computer, it could be a microphone. Okay, so that information is going into the computer. It could be typing, all right, uploading of images, those types of things. Okay, so there's our input. And then this is our CPU, right? So computer, the central processing unit, but for us, our CPU is actually called the CNS. And the CNS, we can see at the bottom here, stands for Central Nervous System, okay? So that's at the bottom there. So the CNS is the Central Nervous System, and that is the brain and the spinal cord. So those two parts make up our Central Nervous System. So our brain processes and then figures out what it's going to do, right? Maybe a ball comes at me and I'm going to catch the ball, right? So I have an output. Or maybe I'm going through the fight or flight response and I need to send a message to the adrenal glands to release epinephrine, right? So that's my response. That's my output. And my output affects the effector. So for example, if I'm talking about a computer, the output could be that I'm printing something, or I'm hearing a sound, or I'm seeing an image, right? Those are all outputs. These outputs are part of our peripheral nervous system, okay? So our inputs and our outputs are part of our peripheral, but the processing is happening in our central nervous system, okay? So our goal with talking about neurons is they're just the functional cells, and we're going to talk about how those cells work, but then we'll get into the two different, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system in our next booklet and kind of talk about what those things are all about. Okay. All right. Okay. So what happens here is receptors detect, receptors detect information about the internal or external environment. So messages are sent to the central nervous system through neurons. So you hear a sound, right? So that's our peripheral nervous system. We're hearing a sound, and then it's going to send a message to our sensory nervous system where we can say, oh, that's the washing machine. Oh, that's someone talking in my class. Oh, right? And we can hear those things. The central nervous system sends messages out to effectors. Effectors are muscles or glands. So it sends messages out. And those messages are to change a response in the body, right? So for example, when the sympathetic nervous system targets the adrenal glands, right? That's to cause the fight or flight response, or to cause an obvious response, catching a ball, okay? All right, so neurons are functional cells of the nervous system, and they have a weird shape, okay? So they're functional cells, and just to give you a thing to think about, 1 cubic centimeter of brain, so that's a milliliter. So 1 milliliter of brain tissue has about 50 million neurons, okay? So what we're seeing here, this is a cell body, whoops. We'll talk about what these parts are in a second here, but we see some cell bodies. But we see that these neurons are branched and they connect with other neurons. And then this one branches out, it connects to another neuron. And these guys are all branched together. So we have this web of neurons. So each neuron may communicate with thousands of other neurons. We also have other cells that are part of our nervous system, but they're not conducting cells. So neurons conduct messages from one to the next to the next to an effector. But we have non-conducting cells called neuroglial cells. And these help to support our nervous system, but they're not conducting. So things that they might do, they might offer some connective. They might serve as connective tissue to connect nervous tissue to other things. They might repair damage. And they might be responsible for moving foreign particles, right? So they kind of have an immune system effect, these neuroglial cells. Now there's one specific neuroglial cell that we're going to talk about. That one you need to know the name of, but we'll get to that in a second. All right. Okay, so let's look at neurons and think about all of these parts and what they do here. Okay. So what we have, if I look over here, okay, actually, what I would like you guys to do, because this is what I usually do when I teach this, so let's just, I'm going to make me a bit bigger. There we can. There we go. All right. What I want you to do, have your hand up like this. Okay. Lose my, you guys. There we go. I want you to put your hand up like this. Okay. And I want you to wiggle your fingers. Okay. So put your hand up like this and wiggle your fingers. Our wiggling fingers are what are referred to as dendrites. And these guys, they receive messages. So our dendrites receive messages. Our wiggling little fingers here are dendrites. And then that message is going to pass through the length of the neuron. Okay? And it's going to pass through this sort of flat structure. So imagine the palm of your hand is this flat structure. That's the cell body. Okay? That's the area of the neuron that has most of the organelles and has the nucleus. And then the signal, so it's going to go from the dendrites through the cell body, and then it's going to pass through this other kind of tube called the axon. And then the axon branches off so it can send a message to the next neuron. When these send messages from one to the other, the dendrites is where it always starts in a neuron. So we start with the dendrites, the message goes through the cell body, down through the axon, and then the little branches of the axon are going to send to the next dendrites of the next neuron, and it's going to travel through there, through the cell body, through the axon, to the next neuron. And the neurons actually don't touch. There's a little gap in between them, okay? So those messages get sent that way. So that's what you want to think about. It always starts with the dendrites and then works its way down towards the axon. Okay, so when I take a look at this image, the very first thing that I'm seeing, so this little arrow at the top is telling me the direction, right? So this is the impulse. So the impulse is coming this way. So the impulse is being received by the dendrites, okay? So we have dendrites. So those are the little branches. And then this big piece that we see in the middle is called the cell body. So think of that as the palm of your hand, right? That's the cell body. So most of the organelles are there, and we have a nucleus there, okay? And then that's going down into an axon. All right, so when we think about a neuron, if we think back to grade 10, when you learned about the difference between animal and plant cells, right? You learned about plant cells being like these little boxes, sort of a rectangular pyramid shape, and animal cells were like these amorphic blobs. Now, you've learned since then that some animal cells have very specific shapes. Well, neurons have very specific shapes. And if I take a look at this neuron, right, everywhere where I see yellow, that's all the same cell. So this is the same cell as this, as all the little yellow I see there. But the white that I see is a different cell, okay? But everything that has yellow, that's all the same cell. This particular neuron has been covered by some other cells. All right, so let's just talk about this a little bit more. So our signal is going from our dendrites. So it's traveling from our dendrites through the cell body, and then it's going through the axon. And the axon, that message is going to travel, 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 travel until these little branches at the end of the axon. And then from those branches, it can make its way and send a message to another neuron, or to an effector, which is a muscle cell or a gland, okay? So we're going to talk about all these different parts here. So let's go to the next section here. So this white stuff, so we see all these little white sections, and they're just sections. Here's a section here, and a section here, and a section here. collectively, all of those sections are called the myelin sheath. So the myelin sheath is on not every single neuron, but it's on the axon of some neurons. And when it's on the axon of some neurons, we call those neurons myelinated. But if you notice, there's little bare spaces between the myelin, and those have a special name. And those spaces are called the nodes of Ranvier. Okay, so another fun little word to say, nodes of Ranvier. So the nodes of Ranvier are the gaps between the myelin. Then we go to the next part here. Oh, whoops. And we have the very end point, and the end point of the axon. So you see all of these little branches have an end point. See little bulbs at the end? Those little bulbs are called synoptic knobs. So these endpoints, they can also be called axon terminals. So either name is fine. Okay, and that's where that next message will be sent along to the next neuron or effector. All right. So when I think about the myelin, okay, the myelin is actually, I'm just gonna make myself smaller over here. I'm gonna look at these last two parts here. So this is just a blown up image. So when I look over here, I see that a cross section has been made. So that's what I'm looking at. So we see a bigger image of the node of Ranvier, a node of Ranvier. We see some myelin, but then we see what the myelin is. The myelin's actually a cell that's wrapped around something. So what we want to think about is we have the axon, right? So this green pen here is an axon. What the myelin does is it just wraps around. Actually, let me grab some smaller myelin. 1 second. So what the myelin does, or these little cells, is these cells just wrap around like this. Okay, so they go to the myelin and then they wrap around. So they're wrapped, but they're flat like a pancake. And then the next one comes along and it wraps around. But we see there's a little green pen in the middle. So that would be the node of Ranvier in the middle. And we see the myelin, okay? So this is the nucleus of that little flat cell. So it's not the same cell as our neuron. It's its own cell and with its own nucleus. And these cells are called Schwann cells. The W is pronounced like a V. So Schwann cells. So Schwann cells with their nucleus wrapped flat like pancakes around the axon. Okay. All right. So what happens, a myelinated neuron, a neuron that has myelin, is that our signal, what happened to my little thing here? Let's go back here. Our signal jumps. So rather than our neural transmission having to travel through the entire axon, it can just go from node to node to node to node. And it makes our signal go much, much faster. Okay? All right. So, dendrites. So they're neurofibers on one end of the neuron. Okay? They're the ones that receive the message. So dendrites receive message. They get the message from sensory receptors. Now these could be receptors like photoreceptors in our eye. They could be taste receptors on our tongue. They could be proprioceptors that are in our joints, so we know the position of where our body parts are. Okay, so we have all these different receptors in different locations in our body. What happens is once these dendrites get a message, so they can get a message from sensory receptors or they could get a message from another neuron, right? Once they get the message, then that signal starts to pass through the dendrites and towards the cell body. So the dendrites are going to move that message toward the cell body. Remembering that cells can have thousands of dendrites. So we have all these branches, which allows for our neurons to be very interconnected with one another. All right, so now let's take a look at the cell body. So the cell body is the part of the neuron with the nucleus and most of the cell's organelles. So if I take a look at this, right, this is the cell body. So what I see here is I see a whole lot of dendrites, and then I see some synaptic knobs from some other neuron sending a message. So here's some synaptic knobs of other neurons sending their message here to the dendrites of this neuron, and then that message is going to pass through the cell body, and then it's going to make its way through the axon. So this is the axon, and then in this case, the axon is myelinated. Okay. All right. Then we have the axon. Well, axons can be really, really long. Axons over 1 meter. Now, not in me, because I'm vertically challenged, but with some of you non-vertically challenged people, axons can be fairly long. So neuron fibers that conduct impulses away from the cell body. So if we're trying to send a message to move our big toe, okay, our message has to go from this neuron, which is going to branch off of, so our brain is saying, move your big toe, okay? So that message from our brain is going to pass through our spinal cord, and it's going to go to the very bottom part of our spinal cord, kind of towards where our tailbone is. And then that's going to branch off to a different neuron, and that neuron is going to make its way all the way to my big toe. That's how long an axon can be, okay? So the distance from where my tailbone is to my big toe probably isn't a meter, but in some of you it is. So axons can be really long. But remember, neuron fibers are teeny, teeny, tiny. So it's going to be very thin. You wouldn't be able to see it, okay? And it would be part of a nerve, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So axons will branch. So we have the axon that's running down, but remember, it has these little branches with synaptic knobs or axon terminals at the end. And then they're going to send a message to the next neuron or to a muscle or to a gland. Okay. And remember, axons can be covered by a myelin sheath. All right. Okay, so let's just do a real quick review. Oh, I see I had a question. Sorry, I missed it. Do the Schwann cells make up the myelin sheath? Yes, they do. So the Schwann cells do make up the myelin sheath only in the peripheral nervous system. So the nervous system that makes up everything but our brain and spinal cord. In our brain and spinal cord, they don't. It's something different that we don't need to know about. All right. We are going to actually move on to the next slide. Okay, myelin sheath. So the myelin sheath is made up of Schwann cells that wrap around the axon. So here's our Schwann cell. We see it starting to wrap around. We see it's wrapping around. Now it's making its way around, and it has its own independent nucleus because it's its own independent cell. Okay. Ethan's asking if a person who's shorter would have better reaction time. It probably wouldn't be significant because we're talking about meters per second. So 150 meters per second, if we're looking at an extra 20 centimeters, it's probably not going to make a huge amount of difference in the individual. Okay. Let's put that over here. And, okay. Neurons with a myelin sheath are myelinated. Myelin speeds up neural transmission. So that's really the whole point of having myelin, is it makes neural transmission faster. Now, Schwann cells are an example of neuroglial cells. Remember, we talked about those cells that are helper cells. So Schwann cells, oops, are neuroglial cells. That's the only one that you need to know an example of. So Schwann cells are the example you need to know. How common do neurons? Most neurons have a myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system. I think it's pretty common. Yeah. When we get to the central nervous system, it's not as common because we have gray matter, and our gray matter isn't myelinated at all. All right. Next. Okay, the nodes of Ranvier. So these are the small spaces between the Schwann cells. So the regions of their axon. right? So they're axon that's not covered. So they're regions of axon that's bare. It's not covered by the myelin, so there's no Schwann cell on it. Due to the presence of myelin, nerve impulses are going to jump from node to node to node to node. This is a neural transmission that's known as saltatory conduction, okay, where they jump from node to node to node. So nerve impulses travel about 150 meters per second in myelinated and 5 meters per second in non-myelinated. So we're looking at a difference of about 30 times faster. Okay. So here we can see just an image of saltatory conduction. All right. So what I'm seeing is this impulse, rather than traveling through the entire length of the neuron, is going from node to node to node to node. Okay. We'll learn the words depolarized and all that a little bit later, but just understand that we're going from node to node, so the transmission doesn't have to go through the entire length, and that speeds it up significantly. A way that I usually do this in class is I usually have a race with a student, but the student has to shuffle their feet to indicate that they're traveling through every length of the axon, where I get to go hop, 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 hop. So I get to go a lot faster because I get to skip parts of the floor where the student has to go through every part of the floor. Okay, so it's just an example of how it goes faster when we have these gaps, these nodes of Ranvier. All right. And then we have a neural lemma. So the neural lemma is a coating that's on the outermost layer of the Schwann cells. Okay, so I'm just going to put my actually. So if I look here, here's my Schwann cell, right? There's the axon. So it's forming the myelin sheath. So it's collectively, this is called the myelin sheath. The outer layer is something that's called the neural lemma. Okay. And what happens is it helps to repair damaged myelinated neurons in the peripheral nervous system. So not in the central nervous system, but in the peripheral nervous system. So damaged cells can regenerate by growing back into the neural lemma. So it helps for that regeneration to happen. Whereas neural lemma is not found in the central nervous system. So if our peripheral nervous system includes our hand, right? So if I cut my hand, so I cut a knife across my palm, maybe I'm cutting a bagel in my hand, right? Not supposed to do that, but let's say I do. I cut. Chances are I'm not going to lose all the feeling there permanently, because those nerves that I've cut with the neurons that are inside of them will have the neural lemma, which is going to allow for those nerves to reconnect and regenerate. But if I get in an accident that causes my spinal cord to become severed, there is no neural lemma, so there's no opportunity for that to regenerate. Why we evolved that way, I don't know, because it doesn't really make sense that one of the most important parts of our body can't recover from an injury. So yeah, we'll see what the future holds with that. But we have neural lemma, which is responsible for regenerating neurons that have been damaged. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Just move this to the bottom for now. Okay, so here's what we're looking at. This is the myelin sheath and an axon. Okay, so the myelin is sort of this black area. The axon's been filled in to be it's just the way it's been photographed. Okay. So let's go through what all of these parts are. Let's see how good you are at remembering everything we just did. So, of course, I don't remember what order these are in, so we'll just wing it. So I'll just get you to type. What is this that my little spotlight's on? Good. So we are looking at dendrites to start off with. Oh, okay, I had this in the wrong order. and the cell body. And then this middle part of the cell body, what is that? The nucleus. So the cell's nucleus is in the cell body. Okay, so the neural transmission is going to start with the dendrites, travel through the cell body, okay, and it's going to travel down, 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 and we're going to get to this, and this here, you can call it one of two things. Doesn't really matter. What am I looking at here? Okay, so we have the myelin sheath. Good. And then what do we have here? Good. We have an axon. All right. So we've got the myelin sheath and we've got the axon. So we've used certain words over here, so we're going to use some different words over here. I just want to move my, whoops. Chat so I can. There we are. Okay. So now, what do we see at the bottom here? What's this? Good. We have our axon terminals. Axon terminals or synaptic knobs. Either one is fine. Oh, didn't have this in the right order either. And what's this? If we called this the axon, what should we call this little gap? Node of Ranvier. Good. And let's go here. Synaptic knob or axon terminals. Okay. So it's important that you know the parts of the neuron and then what each of those parts is responsible for. Okay. Just checking my time here. All right, this here, we're not going to watch this, but this is a little drag and drop for the different parts of the neuron. So you can go into my PowerPoint and click on this. I have no idea how I could get a drag and drop to work interactively for you guys. You may or may not need the username and password, so I included it in the PowerPoint. Okay, I don't think it's Flash, but it might be. So those of you with Chromebooks, it might not work. All right. In class we would do this, but we're not in class. Okay, white matter. So we've heard about white matter and gray matter. I'm hoping maybe to get to the school, I might videotape myself or maybe bring a brain home and get one of my kids to dissect it. So white matter, neurons in the CNS with myelinated axons. Now note the myelin in the CNS is not created by Schwann cells, so therefore it doesn't have a neurolemma. Okay, so it doesn't have that regeneration property, but white matter means there's myelin. So when you dissect the brain, which is what we were supposed to be doing, when you dissect the brain, you can actually see very distinctly the difference between the white matter and the gray matter. Now in the brain, it's not actually white and gray, it's just various shades of sort of a pinky gray color. Gray matter, they're the neurons in the CNS that don't have a myelin sheath. A lot of our gray matter is on the outer part of our brain, and that's where most of that processing happens of information. Okay. All right. Multiple sclerosis. So this is just a time to talk about multiple sclerosis. Just out of curiosity, any of you guys know anyone that has multiple sclerosis? Or did have it? Yeah, we got a yes there. It's a good one for us to talk about, and the reason why is it's very, very prevalent in Alberta. Okay, my grandfather, step-grandfather, died of multiple sclerosis when I was 13. But the interesting, or I don't know, its rates are super high in Canada, and in Alberta they're really, really high. It's one of the highest frequencies of multiple sclerosis in the world. So I don't know why that is. It shows that it may not be a genetic factor, because my grandfather and then a good friend of mine, her brother, has had it for years and is living in a nursing home. So what multiple sclerosis is it's an autoimmune disease, and the immune system actually attacks the myelin sheath. Okay. So the myelin sheath, remember, that speeds up neural transmission. It also is a bit of a protection against sort of signals going from one neuron to another. So it helps to protect the axon, results in a loss of muscle control and brain function. And because it's an autoimmune disorder, there you can take immunosuppressive drugs to treat it, but there is no cure for it. So we're going to watch just a little 1-minute video on multiple sclerosis. So I keep this up, so I am hoping that this works for us. Just need to share the sound on the computer. All right. And
MS is a disease that affects the central nervous system, the CNS, which consists of the brain, spinal cord, and optic nerves. Everything we do, whether it's taking a step, solving a problem, or simply breathing, relies on the proper functioning of the CNS. To understand how MS may impact the CNS, we must explore the disease at the cellular level. In the brain, millions of nerve cells called neurons continually send and receive signals. Each signal is a minute but necessary part of intricate CNS orchestrations that culminate in the actions, sensations, thoughts, and emotions that comprise the human experience. Normally, the path over which a nerve signal travels is protected by a type of insulation called the myelin sheath. This insulation is essential for nerve signals to reach their target. In MS, the myelin sheath is eroded, and the underlying wire-like nerve fiber is also damaged. This leads to a breakdown in the ability of the nerve cells to transmit signals. It is believed that the loss of myelin is the result of mistaken attacks by immune cells. Immune cells protect the body against foreign substances, such as bacteria and viruses. But in MS, something goes awry. Immune cells infiltrate the brain and spinal cord, seek out the myelin, and attack. As ongoing inflammation and tissue damage occurs, nerve signals are disrupted. This causes unpredictable symptoms that can range from numbness or tingling to blindness and paralysis.
all right, so that is multiple sclerosis. So what's super weird about it is that we can have different symptoms. I'll get to your question in a second, Ethan. We can have different symptoms of multiple sclerosis. So one day you can wake up and not be able to see, but then the next day you can't. One day your arm might be paralyzed and the next day it's not. And then eventually the symptoms become progressively worse and worse over a period of time. And at first, when my grandfather was diagnosed with it, we didn't really tie to reduced cognitive ability, but it seems now that they're understanding more that it can have an ability on your ability of your self-awareness and stuff as well over a period of time. But yeah, so it's a difficult disease. There was a time where a lot of people were going to Europe to get different treatments done. The idea was if you kind of opened up the passages to allow more oxygen to the brain, that maybe that could help. So I don't know where those are at. I think a lot of the people that saw some success with that, it's reverted back. But yeah, it's just one to talk about because it's one that's very common here in Alberta. So for us to understand, I know there's research on it, but there's no real definitive answer as to why we seem to have higher levels here. So it would seem, because we are fairly transient in Alberta, it would seem that it has something to do with our environment. Okay, so Ethan's asked, is it possible to fry the central nervous system from overuse? It depends what you're talking about from overuse. Like you can do damage to your central nervous system with different kind of drugs, but I'm not sure what you mean by overuse. Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next slide here. Okay, so neurons are actually housed in nerves. Okay, so neurons are housed in a nerve. So a nerve is a bundle of neurons, right? So they're all connected by connective tissue. And so when we look at this image here, it's kind of cool because we can see here's an illustration of a nerve, and if you do a cross section of it, we can see here's an axon, right? So we can see all the little axons. So it's a bundle of neurons. And here's a scanning electron micrograph. So this is a real life image using a scanning electron microscope. So we can see all the axons running through. So it's kind of like when we think about a cable. If we cut that cable, we'd see a whole lot of copper wires running through that cable. That's what's going on with us, except we have like hundreds of them running through our nerves. So when we talk about a nerve is like all of these neurons running through it, and then they're all connected or surrounded by connective tissue in this nerve, okay? All right, and we have a lot of different nerves, and we'll talk about a few of them. Like one of them we talked about is our sympathetic nervous system. So it's a nerve, a branch off our spinal cord, filled with neurons. Okay, sensory neurons. So we're going to talk about 3 different types of neurons. So sensory neurons. So these guys collect information about our environment, okay, either internal or external. So they collect information about our environment. Sensory receptors collect information about our environment, and then they're going to send messages to the sensory neuron. So that's going to be received by the dendrites, okay? And then eventually that's going to make its way to our central nervous system for processing, okay? So sensory neurons are found in our peripheral nervous system. So that's where most of the parts of them are. There's a small part of them that's in our central nervous system. The cell body is in the center. So we've talked about the cell body earlier. What we were looking at was a motor neuron, but this cell body is in the center. So we have the dendrites, axon, and then this here is just a little gap to indicate that there's just a large section of neuron, just easier to fit on the page. So it's a large section of neuron. So we can see that the cell body is really going to be quite close to our spinal cord, because we want to imagine, right? If I have a sensory receptor in my finger that's going to detect temperature, okay, that's going to send a message through a sensory neuron, and that's going to make its way to my central nervous system, which is in my spine, right? This cell body is right close to my spine, okay? So that's something important to understand when I talk about a different concept a little bit later, okay? So the cell body is not right by the dendrites like we saw in the motor neuron. It's in a different location. So sensory neurons have a different location for the cell body, and they're taking information from the internal or external environment that they've received from sensory receptors, and they're sending that information to the central nervous system. Okay. Interneurons. So we know inter means between. So interneurons, they're only found in the central nervous system. And they're the link between sensory neurons and motor neurons. So we see these guys are a little smaller. Here's a dendrite, cell body. We still see the axon between the myelin here. We see the synaptic knobs here at the end, okay? And then motor neurons. So this is like the neuron that we initially labeled. So we see all the dendrites. We see the cell body. The signal's going to go through here. And then here we see that a big gap. So a motor neuron is going to send a message from the central nervous system. So that's our brain or spinal cord. So we want to imagine that we've got these motor neurons that are shooting out the sides of our spinal cord, and they're going to go to different parts of our body. So they might tell our fingers to bend. They might tell our adrenal gland to release epinephrine. Okay? So we see this really long region after the cell body, okay? So it's sending a message to an effector, any tissue or organ, so muscle basically, or organ that carries out a command of the nervous system, okay? So muscle or gland. So again, this indicates a long section because it's hard to draw that big long thing on there. All right, now, we will do this page and then we'll stop there for the day, okay? So what are we looking at here? I'm just going to move these so you can see the top of the diagram to start off with. Okay, so what we're looking at is just a little pathway. So here we have a piece of skin. We've got some sensory receptors here, so they could be detecting pain or a sense of touch or temperature, okay? And they are sending a message to this sensory neuron. So here's our sensory neuron, okay? Now we want to imagine that interneuron is sitting in our spinal cord. So let's think about that. The interneuron's hanging out in our spinal cord. So the sensory neuron coming from our skin, sending a message to the spinal cord, and then it's going to go to the interneuron. Okay, so let's talk about the parts. So what are we looking at here? So I'll just get you guys to help me label this by chatting it up. All right, so the first thing we're looking at is the axon. Good. Okay, node of Ranvier or axon, either one is fine. And then we have a cell body. Okay, so now let's go to the next part. Now this is sort of labeled right at this little line here, so that would be the axon. But again, unless I'm clear with what I want from you guys, I wouldn't worry about either or. Okay, and what are we seeing right at the little end here? Good, axon terminals, awesome, okay. So synaptic knobs or axon terminals, those terms are interchangeable. Okay, so our sensory neuron is sending that message, right? And that message got to the end of the sensory neuron. So now these little synaptic knobs, they're going to release some chemicals and they're going to send a message to the next cell, which is the interneuron. So what's this part of the interneuron called? Awesome. So we have the dendrites. What's this part of the interneuron called? Good. The cell body, and then the nucleus is up above it. Okay, good. So the cell body, dendrites and cell body. And what's this part called? Okay, it's moving away from the cell body. The axon. Awesome. Okay, so the message is now has gone through the interneuron. Okay, and we see all the synaptic knobs at the end of the interneuron. And I'm just going to move this up now so we can see the bottom part here. Me over there. Okay, so now we have, move this up too. There we go. Okay, now we're looking over here. So this is receiving the message. We see more of these over here. So what do we call this? Dendrites. Good. Because I don't remember my order, we're going to go ahead to this one. What do I call this part of this neuron, the motor neuron? Cell body. Okay, awesome. So we have cell body and dendrites. All right, and then this little tube thing in the middle here. Excellent, the axon. And then this, because it's pointed to the nucleus, is actually referring to the cell. What cell is this? Excellent, Schwann cell. Okay, so we have a Schwann cell. And then we have a little gap here. What do we call that? This one here, node of Ranvier. Okay, and then here's my effector, which in this situation is a muscle cell. All right, well, it seems to me that you guys are getting these parts, so that's really all we've done today is just the parts, and then knowing the difference between a sensory neuron, a motor neuron, and interneuron. Axon and node of Ranvier. Well, node of Ranvier is a region of bare axon. So if you call it an axon, that's fine. And if you call it a node of Ranvier, that's fine. Because really, when we say node of Ranvier, that's a gap between Schwann cells. So if I went over here, because I don't see any Schwann cells, if I called this a node of Ranvier, that would be wrong. So this is just axon. But if I look over here, and I see this bare piece, I could call that an axon, or because it's between two Schwann cells, I could also call it a node of Ranvier. So either one is fine in that situation. Any other questions, guys? All right, so I will finish off marking your endocrine quizzes in the next hour or two. So you'll have those so you can take a look at them and ask me any questions that you need to. That's absolutely fine. And then you'll have your unit test Monday that opens at noon. And then Monday, we're going to continue with this and we're going to talk about neural transmission in quite a bit of detail. And then you'll have a worksheet on Monday on that stuff. All right. Any other questions? Okay, we're going to call it a day. So you guys have a very wonderful weekend. Take some time for yourselves, and we will see you on Monday.